Welcome to the Sci-Fi Evolution channel. The capsules descended with a hiss, landing on the moist, mossy soil of Xeno 7. Steam rose from the exhaust valves and dispersed into the treetops. From an orbiting spaceship, 20 elite cadets were thrown into separate areas of the forest, each selected from a different species known for their survival abilities. For many of them, this was a significant event, the last test before graduation from the Galactic Ranger Academy, a milestone that separates officers from ordinary soldiers, legends from mediocrity. However, none of them expected Xeno 7 to be so alive. The trees stood tall, not in a uniform verticality like the pines of Terra, but in a sinuous, pulsating geometry. Lyra Fess squinted as each trunk seemed to stretch and shift ever so slightly, their bark glistening in the light as if covered in sweat. The air was heavy with the smell of rot and vegetable oils, and even the ground underfoot seemed alive. The boots made a light sound as she walked on the stretched drum. She silently exited her capsule without a word, without activating the small emergency beacon located next to the hatch. She knew that this could not be done in such a test, as the signals would mean failure. Above her, bright flashes indicated other capsules descending through the foliage, some crashing clumsily into branches, others guided by graceful repulsor stabilizers that softened their descent. She knew that most of her classmates had brought with them advanced biological enhancements, skin-responsive instruments, adaptive optics, or species-specific survival glands. She took with her only her body, her mind, and what the ancient forests of Terra had once taught her. It wasn't arrogance, it was instinct. She turned and crouched down, touching the surface beneath her. It was soft, a thick layer of decaying vegetation and strange, intertwining root systems. The microorganisms tried to analyze its chemical composition. Lyra Vex stood up, shaking the wet soil off her hands, and began to move a short distance in the neighboring area. A tall, purple-skinned cadet named Zephyr was making subharmonic clicks, using echolocation to scan the surroundings. His kind, the Krill, was famous for navigating the voids of dead moons using only acoustic reflection. However, on Xeno 7, his clicks were absorbed by the leaves, which did not reflect any sound. Frustrated, he clicked louder, but the forest remained silent. The Krill cadet blinked in confusion, then froze as a large creature rustled behind him. The creature was still moving, aware of the sound in the distance, but it didn't change its pace. It had already followed the test rules. No technology, no outside help, no communication, and no escape for the next 24 standard hours. The goal was simple: to survive in an unpredictable environment. The teacher intentionally left the meaning of building a shelter capable of withstanding nighttime changes in the ecosystem intentionally vague. She was standing in a clearing surrounded by jagged rocks and dilapidated trees. She could tell that there were others here too, perhaps just moments ago. They probably moved on, looking for higher or flatter ground. She stayed, feeling that this place was a natural barrier. The air was slightly cooler, and the strange sounds echoing through the forest seemed to subside as they approached the area. She put down her small survival kit and started looking for trees to climb. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, a blue-skinned cadet named Kai from the aquatic world of Aquarius was struggling to adapt to the terrestrial environment. Instantly, he tried to build a shelter by gathering wide leaves and applying secreting gels from his palms. However, the leaves did not stick. He screamed in his native language and waved away the insects. The insects disintegrated into clouds of caustic steam upon contact. His screams echoed through the forest. Another cadet called out to him, but the forest swallowed up the sound. Lyra Vex was standing at the base of a tree that looked healthy and sturdy enough to climb. She leaned on him for support, and the branches overhead looked thick and promising. She reached for a small vine and pulled it. She was tough. Using it as a support, she pulled herself up, wrapping her legs around the trunk. Her shoes found small natural protrusions. The wood had a metallic smell, as if the sap contained iron or copper, and its surface was slippery. One move at a time, she climbed the tree. Lyra Vex was carefully peeling long strips of bark from the inner branches. These strips, softened, could be used as a rope. She hummed softly as she worked, a habit she developed while camping in the Appalachian Mountains on Terra. The sound seemed to calm her down, and more importantly, it didn't disturb the forest. The hours passed, and the sun barely moved, but the shadows shifted in an alarming way. Time seemed to flow differently here. Lyra Vex wasn't looking at the sky. She trusted her own rhythm. She could hear voices, screams, uttered in panic. There have been theories about magnetic shielding and local gravity pockets. Some cadets believed that trees were alive and connected in a neural network. Others believed that the ordeal was a psychological simulation. But none of that mattered to her. All that mattered was to stay above ground and stay dry. As night approached, a loud, guttural sound echoed through the trees on the other side of the forest. It was like the roar of a giant. Another scream echoed through the forest, indicating that someone had encountered one of the local predators. Lyra Vex flinched, but remained in her position. She had already chosen her place and intended to complete her platform before nightfall. Her mind, honed by years of hiking, building and surviving without modern technology, did not allow panic. She had already faced fear and overcome it. She would do it again. She tied the first branch using 2 strips of bark, tying and twisting them the way she had practiced countless times. The platform slowly, quietly took shape. The trees swayed gently beneath her, and a cool breeze swept by, making her feel weightless for a moment. But she was grounded, not to the ground, but to her confidence. Below, the shelter of another cadet collapsed with a loud crash, followed by angry curses. Lyra Vex didn't even look down. She reached for another branch. There was still a lot to do. The lights started to go out, not like before. Lyra Vex was working in the woods, gradually sinking into the evening. Suddenly, golden rays of sunlight pierced through the foliage, casting dancing patterns on the leaves and branches. In the next instant, the shadows began to engulf everything in long, uneven streaks. The crowns of the forest seemed to react to the fading light, as if a living curtain was descending across the sky. Lyra Vex stopped her work, sitting motionless on a high branch. Her shelter hadn't been completed yet, but it was already sturdy enough to support her weight and protect her from above. She arranged several large palm-like leaves on top, securing them with braided bark fibers. The structure swayed slightly, but it was solid underneath. The forest was changing not only in terms of light. The atmosphere was also changing. The temperature dropped sharply, bringing with it a damp, musty chill that clung to her skin and clothes. Lyra Vex reached for the cloth she had hidden in her belt pouch, a square of thermal material woven from the fibers of Terra's earth. Lyra Vex wrapped herself in an insulating material, trying not to shake it too much so as not to upset her balance. The smell of vegetable oils was no longer in the air. Instead, it smelled of metal, like wet iron mixed with a faintly sweet and nauseating odor. In the distance, a high-pitched screech broke the silence of the forest. It was not a sound that Lyra Vex could identify as human or belonging to any species she knew. A screech came from the western sector, echoed once before abruptly fading away. The forest was silent again. Lyra Vex leaned forward slightly, keeping her balance, her gaze fixed on the dark areas below, where the undergrowth rustled without any breeze. Something was moving there, something heavy. She could feel it in the vibrations of the trunk beneath her. A short, stocky alien cadet named Thorn stumbled into the foliage nearby. He chose a low-lying pool for shelter, believing that the soft soil would be easier to dig and build a nest. His kind, the Brontax, were instinctive diggers. Thorn spent the afternoon digging a shallow trench in the ground for warmth, but the soil proved resistant. The earth was covered with organic matter, which moved and reacted when disturbed. With thick arms covered in dark mud, Thorn tried to get out of the sucking quagmire. But his foot got tangled in a vine-like root that wrapped around his ankle, tightening with each attempt to escape. With a grunt, he fell backwards, landing on the wet ground. His cries for help were swallowed up by the unnatural acoustics of the forest. Lyra Vex watched from above, not with malice, but with solemn awareness. If she had gone out earlier in the day, even once, to check if someone was responding nearby, the echo would have returned distorted, carrying her own voice in the opposite direction, as if mocking her. She realized that the sound couldn't be trusted here, so she remained in silence. Thorn struggled for a few more moments before finally managing to cut through the vine with his field blade. He didn't look up, unaware that he was being watched. Nearby, a slender cadet named Sirius, from a species living on a planet with a light atmosphere and levitation based on pollen, was trying to create a floating shelter. She gathered large white flowers and began activating their air sacs, expecting them to lift a hammock-like structure that she wove between them. However, the gravity of Xenos 7 did not cooperate, and instead the pouches exploded, releasing a thin glowing mist that stuck to her exoskeleton. At first she thought it was harmless, but then it started to itch and then burn. Sirius screamed, her movements becoming erratic and wild, the light from the fog creating a surreal halo around her. Lyra Vex looked away, knowing there was nothing she could do. The sun, or whatever its likeness is here, has gone out. Darkness descended like a closing curtain. Lyra Vex struck a small stone against another one she found embedded in the bark of a tree, creating a few faint sparks. It was a small spark, but it had made a small nest out of dried moss and bark scrapings. After a few more strokes, the ember caught fire. She bent down, blowing carefully, lighting the fire with confident hands. A faint orange glow emerged from the nest, and she transferred it to a simple bowl made from the spiral bark she had carved earlier. The fire didn't last long, but it was enough to warm her hands and dispel the momentary chill. She placed the glowing bark inside a reflective leaf dome to hide the light from predators. From the trees further away, the sounds of movement intensified. Lyra Vex could hear claws scraping against the bark, wet paw pads pressing into the moss, and long tails rustling through the leaves. Nothing had come close yet, but she could sense the interest of the Xenos 7 creatures, attracted by their keen sense of smell. A flickering light would attract their attention. The noise would have alarmed them. The bravest could be attracted by the warmth. She sat motionless. Her heart was calm. Her legs folded under her, her arms crossed, her breathing slowed to a barely discernible level. Another scream echoed, this time a short, suffocating sigh. A large cadet named Brutus had built a shelter out of broad leaves and thorny stems earlier in the day. Now, in the darkness, those stalks began to curl, tying themselves into knots that squeezed the shelter and pierced his back. He thought the spikes were inert, but he was wrong. His scream was followed by silence, followed by a long, drawn-out noise. Lyra Vex didn't look up. Another cadet activated his emergency beacon, a small red light pulsing in the darkness as the tow truck descended. The drone scanned the area, extended its arms, and unhesitatingly retrieved the cadet. One less voice in the dark. Lyra Vex continued to count in her mind. 18 left, maybe less? Suddenly, a blinding light appeared right in front of me. She watched them for a while, mesmerized by their dancing. Then she turned her gaze back to the ground where the creature was. It's gone. The knots in the bark wrapped gently around her shelter, their presence neither painful nor aggressive. They just hung in the air. Their light was warm and steady. She watched them for a few minutes. One of them landed on her hand. For the first time since the capsule landed, she smiled. She had survived the initial onslaught, but the night was far from over, and she knew it would only get worse. The forest pulsed with silent menace as the night deepened into its deepest silence. The air was oppressive, like a heavy blanket, soaked in moisture. Every branch above her trembled with invisible tension, and every breeze sounded like a whisper from a mouth just out of sight. And yet, despite the darkness below and the strange glow above, she remained motionless on her perch. Her mind was methodically going over the next steps she needed to take. She still had to secure the outer perimeter of her treehouse platform, and there were still cracks in the roof that could let in dew or, worse, something else. But she had time. Her instinct told her that. Predators preyed on those who panicked and acted out of fear. So she waited until the cold became truly unbearable before resuming her work. The temporary thermal wrap on her shoulders absorbed most of the moisture. So she took it off, folded it, and placed it on a nearby tree. She rubbed her hands vigorously, then took out a handful of dry twigs that she had prepared earlier. They were perfectly curved to connect. Lyra Vex squatted down, balancing carefully, connecting two branches into an improvised joint, then tied them with the remaining fibrous cord. She worked slowly and purposefully, her mind free of calculations or theoretical possibilities. She wasn't running simulations in her head. She was listening to the wind, the occasional snapping of distant branches, and the barely noticeable pull of her rope as she pulled on it. The difference between instinct and intelligence has never been more obvious. Most of the other cadets were trained in adaptive tactical response using predictive algorithms, survival instincts, and AI scenario planning. She was also taught by her grandfather in the remote wilderness of Oregon, where they do not guess, but observe, do not predict, but listen. Another event happened far below. A slender, tall cadet with translucent skin named Orion created a structure in a clearing made of pressed leaves and hardened sap. It looked flawless, with perfect geometric proportions, but it lacked height, and now it served as a heat trap, attracting night scavengers attracted by the smell of resinous juice. Lyra Fess heard his muffled screams, followed by a sharp squeal. The structure collapsed inside when something broke through the wall. A moment later, a figure emerged from the ruins. The distinctive drone of a tow truck echoed through the forest canopy, growing stronger and fading. She remained unperturbed, not even looking up. Her goal was not to surpass others, but to outlive the forest itself. She fixed the last corner pillar, creating a solid triangular structure. Then she took out two large leaves shaped like open wings and began to attach them to the top, using the small needle-like bones that she had prepared in advance. The process was slow but thorough. Thorns pierced through the leaves, securing them securely in place. The veins in the leaves, undamaged, created a waterproof barrier when they were stitched. This barrier naturally bent along with the structure, forming a dome that drained moisture away from the edges. When she was done, she lowered herself into the center of her shelter and tested its flexibility by shifting her weight from side to side. The structure swayed slightly, but remained stable. It creaked once, then calmed down. For the first time since arriving on Xeno 7, she lay on her back. Above her, small stars shone through the cracks in the canopy, although some of them twinkled and moved, clearly not being stars at all. She knew that some forest creatures had evolved to mimic the heavenly patterns to attract prey. Even the sky couldn't be trusted here. She reached into the cavity next to her and took out the round fruit she had picked earlier. It looked like an avocado, but with a spiral skin. She noticed that small rodents consumed this fruit without any side effects, which prompted her to try it herself. She peeled off the outer layer and enjoyed the fruit. She carefully unwrapped the spiral, revealing the soft green interior. It had a slight smell of cucumber and iron. She took a small bite. It was tasteless and a little gritty, but nutritious. She chewed slowly, trying to conserve her energy as much as her calories. Her body needed something warm, but she wasn't risking making a full-fledged fire yet. As she ate, she reflected on the shift in her thinking that had brought her to this moment. Lyra Vex recalled her initial orientation at the academy, where the alien cadets arrived with pride and ceremonial armor. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with contempt. No one expected that a human girl from Terra would be able to compete with minds bred for adaptability or bodies designed for resilience. But she didn't come from the sterile cities of Terra. Most galactic officials knew that she had grown up off-world, climbing trees higher than towers, setting raccoon traps, and repairing broken solar panels with duct tape and perseverance. Her training didn't come from the labs. The sound of scratching knees and checking the weather came to her. Another sound reached her ears, closer this time. She sat up slowly, every joint quiet, her eyes scanning the lower branches. The shadow moved steadily and slowly across the forest floor. The creature was tall, with limbs that bent too many times, a narrow head that moved soundlessly, and legs that left no footprints. It passed by her tree, stopped, and raised its head. His eyes, 6 of them, glowed with a soft amber light. Lyra Vex froze, not breathing. The creature waited. Then it turned and moved on, disinterested. She sank back down, letting the tension slowly drain from her shoulders. It sensed others, but it wasn't hungry, or perhaps she hid her presence well enough. In any case, she wasn't going to make assumptions. She wrapped her cloak of leaves more tightly around herself and threw back her head. A sudden burst of frustration echoed through the night from a nearby area. It was Cadet Xerxes, a slender creature with 4 arms and glowing orange eyes. Xerxes, a member of a species with 4 limbs and eyes flickering like flames, spent hours building a floating shelter. By manipulating the magnetic fields of local minerals, he created a floating platform using only his thoughts and the code he wrote on the bark with his species-specific finger chalk. However, something disrupted the stability of the shelter, causing it to spin wildly before it collapsed in a burst of energy. Xerxes let out a cry of frustration, and then there was silence. Another drone, another extraction. Lyra Vex closed her eyes. She didn't celebrate her triumph, because every setback reminded her that the forest doesn't care about intelligence or imagination. He recognized only those who listened, adapted, and respected him. She turned on her side, wrapping herself more tightly in her cloth and leaves. The shelter completely covered her on 3 sides, with a small hole at her knees for air circulation. Her elevated position provided her with protection from land-based hazards. Her scent was hidden, her fire was extinguished, and her tools were gone. Being in a safe shelter, she stayed there, not just alive, but unharmed. She allowed her thoughts to wander not in a dream, but in contemplation. She remembered her mother's voice, reading old adventure stories by candlelight. She remembered her grandfather's words. "Your mind will save you, but only if your body knows when to wait." Those words had been echoing in her mind all day, and now, in the dark depths of the alien forest, they had become her shield. The forest groaned again, but this time Lyra Vex remained unperturbed. The first real scream came after the second burst of darkness. Lyra Vex discovered that the nights on Xeno 7 were not separate events, but an oscillating cycle of shadows and pressure that swept through the canopy like waves. Each wave brought a new layer of cold, a new heaviness in the air, and a change in the sounds from the forest floor. The second wave hit with more force than the first, and Lyra Vex's body reacted. Instinctively, her posture stiffened, her breathing became shallow, and her heartbeat slowed to match the stillness around her. Suddenly, a shrill scream echoed from the north, filled with a sense of urgency. It wasn't a rhythmic scream, but rather a high-pitched wail that pierced through the night like a tearing sound. Lyra Vex sat up, her shelter intact, but the sound reverberated in the bark beneath her. She kept her breathing steady and listened. The scream lasted for 3 long seconds. Then she stopped and recognized the rhythm. It was a male cadet, probably Thunder, a muscular cadet from Drax's volcanic world. He was noisy and mocking during the pre-exam simulations, making fun of her lack of equipment. Now he was either evacuated or being taken apart. A moment later, a bright white light flashed among the trees as a tow truck drone descended. She remained motionless, but the briefly drone hovered in the area and emitted a network of scanning pulses. Then he stood up, carrying something in his arms. Whether it was a body or a spirit, she couldn't tell. Thunder was eliminated from the exam. Another voice fell silent for Lyra Vex. She shifted slightly and checked the tension of the tree bark ropes around the edges of her shelter. Everything was secure, but a slight movement caused a reaction from below. A low growl came from something crouching at the base of her tree. It didn't walk around like the previous predator, but it was still a threat. She waited, not looking down. She closed her eyes and exhaled through her nose. An hour passed, and her muscles ached, and her legs began to shake from being stuck in an uncomfortable position. The growling had stopped, but she knew better than to think the creature was gone. It could have been waiting, or for the natural weakness of exhaustion to take hold of her. So she slowly turned around, resting her legs but keeping the rest of her body alert. The night turned against everyone who was still in the forest. She could feel it. Xeno 7 didn't just accept them, it observed them. To the southeast, a sudden flash of light burst into the trees, green and shimmering. Someone lit a chemical torch. She blinked, then regretted even that move. The light attracted creatures. The torch-bearer was Cadet Olaran from the vibrant world of Ismar. His people thrived in ecosystems rich in light and used bioluminescent flashes to communicate. But this was not his world. The glow illuminated the trees, the area around him, and for a brief moment she watched as his figure darted between the trees, the torch swinging wildly. Then something fast and huge appeared out of the shadows. Too fast to be seen clearly. The torch fell, and the light went out. This time there was no scream, just a thud and silence. The drone hadn't arrived, and she was breathing in dry air, and there was a taste of iron in her mouth. Her hands were cold, even inside the shelter. The tension spread from my muscles to my thoughts. She forced herself to breathe more slowly. Fear was not an option. She didn't need adrenaline, she needed clarity. From above, the branches moved not because of the wind, but because of the weight. Something was climbing, not near her tree, but not far away. The rustling was purposeful, the pauses rhythmic. She turned her head without moving her body, and caught the source in the far corner of her vision. A cadet climbing, not climbing a tree with his bare hands. She recognized his silhouette. It was a young man with wide eyes and a green complexion. The recruit, who hails from a higher gravity world, underestimated the dangers of the forest. Now, trying to imitate the courage of his late mentor, he had no shelter, no plan to rise above the ground, only despair. He reached a high branch, pulled himself up, and began to cry softly, unaware of how the sound was spreading in the upper tier of the forest. Lyra Vex watched as 2 small glowing figures circled the trunk below him. They moved like cats, but their tails were stiff and their eyes were colorless. He didn't see them, but they saw him. She turned away, unable to bear what would happen next. Then there was a chain reaction. One scream led to another. From the west, someone called for help in a broken dialect. From the south, the shelter was engulfed in flames caused by a faulty thermal crystal. The recruit burst into flames and rolled into the undergrowth, setting everything on fire. The viral environment reacted by spraying the fire with a thick layer of blue pollen, extinguishing the flames but leaving a sticky residue. The cadet's fate was sealed. Soon the body was dragged into the vines. No escape, no flash, disappeared without a trace. She knew that the number was decreasing rapidly. She counted again. I was 20 in the beginning. Maybe 10 left. Maybe less. She forced herself to concentrate. She took out a small bag from under a layer of leaves. It was a small bag that she had woven earlier from overlapping strips of bark. Inside, she hid 3 polished stones with a metal coating. They reflected just enough moonlight to serve as warning flashes, but only at close range. She arranged them in a triangular formation next to her elbow. If something approached her platform, she could knock them against each other, creating a vibration, sharp, sudden, and loud. It wouldn't help her escape, but it could distract her. It's a trick. Last option for the rest of the night. Moving forward like a wounded monster. Every breath was a choice. Every sound represented a potential danger. No one else was talking. The forest was silent, even the bravest. A few hours before dawn, the growling returned under her tree. It was closer this time. She clutched the side of her shelter and slowly leaned forward, shifting her weight through a gap in the foliage. She could see it clearly. A massive creature with dark skin and shiny patches of muscle that shimmered in the moonlight. Its nostrils flared as it moved on 6 legs. There was no mouth to be seen, nor was there a split ridge with a fin that trembled with every step. It wasn't hunting, it was searching. She held her breath as it moved away, hitting a nearby tree. The tree groaned under the weight, a low rumble echoing in the earth, in the bark and in its bones. Then it disappeared. She exhaled, eyes wide, fingers still clenched. She had survived the worst that night, but the sun had not yet risen, and she did not trust Xeno 7 to allow dawn without a new trial. The sky didn't lighten gradually. It shattered. A narrow, ash-gray crevice appeared between the trees, not like dawn, but as if an ancient and heavy presence had finally lifted its hand from the crown. The stars went out one by one, some faded naturally, others went out like artificial lights being turned off. The humidity remained, but the atmosphere had changed from the tense silence of hours of hunting to something open and waiting. Lyra Vex opened her eyes not because she heard something, but because the pressure in her chest finally let go. She sat up slowly, pushing aside the layers of leaves covering her shelter and blinking at the light. At first, her joints resisted movement. The hours of immobility had frozen her muscles, and the cold had stuck like a parasite. She stretched her neck and stretched her shoulders, and she clasped her hands tightly, making the joints crack. The platform withstood the storm, despite the fact that the main materials remained intact. The worst was over. She examined the ropes and found that none had broken. Not a single branch bent. Simple materials, chosen not for their novelty but for their reliability, have weathered the storm. She walked to the edge and peered through the leaves. The forest floor turned into a changing picture of ashy moss, broken branches, and dark spots. There was no such thing yesterday. Her tree remained untouched, but not everyone was so lucky. To her right, a few meters away, the shelter collapsed into a pile of charred fibers and burnt vines. A 4-meter claw scratch was dug into the ground, but there were no signs of a body or movement. Only the remnants of panic, half hidden in the morning mist. A faint mechanical sound broke the silence, a low, steady hum. She looked up. Tow truck drones flew over the trees, gliding through the clouds. They changed their formation. Instead of arriving individually in response to emergency signals, they now flew in wide circles, scanning and collecting data in the area. The exam was completed, and she remained in place, motionless, when the first drone descended. He did not approach her. Instead, he hovered over a nearby area, extending his manipulators and lowering the net to collect what looked like a pile of torn cloth. Then, without any ceremony, he pulled in the net. Another setback. The drone turned and rose. The second drone flew directly over her position, hovered for a moment, and then continued on its way. She started counting the number of drones that had arrived and the number of those that had flown away with their cargo. She saw 2 more drones retrieve unharmed cadets, one of whom was limping and barely conscious, while the other was wrapped in emergency stasis gel. She recognized the second cadet as Aru, her exoskeleton now dull and cracked. Lyra Vex watched her rise with a sense of silent respect. She survived, albeit with difficulty. A new drone descended and hovered next to her. This one was different, elegant and black, and had a unique identifier. The emblem of the Galactic Ranger Academy, a diagnostic drone, did not carry medical equipment. Instead, he emitted a narrow beam of light, which he directed upwards, scanning the outside of her shelter. She sat motionless, back straight, chin up, as the drone rotated, examining the base of her platform, joints, and roof structure. He hovered in place for a few moments, as if processing something unexpected. The beam shifted and projected a pale blue circle next to her feet. A small screen appeared in the air, on which one word was displayed in 4 languages. Test. She exhaled and nodded once. The drone retreated, disappearing into the gray morning air. She stood up, straightening to her full height for the first time. Her legs trembled slightly, and the platform creaked beneath her, but she kept her balance. With one last look at the shelter, at the knots she had tied, at the shape she had carved in her memory, not with her hands, she left. The central cord, which had been tied and secured, was now lying loose, and the leaves were gently folded inwards, like a folded blanket. She gathered up her bark pouch, 3 polished stones, and her thermal cloth and began to descend. The descent was slower than the ascent, and each movement required patience, as she double-checked each support before grabbing it with her hands. She took her time, and when her boots touched the forest floor, they sank slightly into the moss, but the weight under her feet felt well-deserved, and the forest no longer pressed down on her with hostility. He remained wary, but no longer angry. As she walked forward, a path to the evacuation site appeared. Not a path in the usual sense, but a corridor where drones were now hanging, and cadets were coming out one by one, limping, beaten, but alive. She walked past a cadet, a man with dull gray skin and empty eyes, who ignored her, which she hadn't expected. The female instructor added, "She was silent throughout the entire cycle." The male instructor said, "She was silent throughout the entire cycle. She didn't ask about her bill. She was indifferent. She passed, and that was all that mattered." As she boarded the waiting shuttle, she caught a glimpse of her reflection. Her face was haggard from stress and hunger. Her clothes were damp and tattered, and her eyes were sunken but unbending. She didn't look at all like the cadets who arrived in immaculate uniforms and polished gear. She looked real. She took her seat and buckled herself in, remaining silent as the other cadets entered the cockpit. Those who survived gathered in silence, without celebrations or conversations. There was just the quiet presence of those who had seen the worst and gone through it. When the shuttle lifted off from Xeno 7, the forest disappeared under the clouds. Lyra Vex closed her eyes not to rest, but to remember, because someday, in a more brutal war or a deeper abyss, what she learned here will be more important than any medal or title. And she won't forget.